Hello, everybody. Welcome to the September session of our Meet a Poet series with the American Center in Moscow. If you're a regular viewer of Meet a Poet, welcome back. And if you're new, we're really glad to have you. So this month, we're delighted to be hosting Chris Santiago as our Poet of the Month. And before getting into Chris's background, I'll explain briefly how this session is going to work. So for the first part of the session, Chris is going to read his work and talk about his inspiration behind it along the way. And then we'll jump back in and transition into a Q&A session. Our moderator, Blair, is going to have some questions prepared, but we're also hoping that you'll have questions as well. So whether you're watching on YouTube, VK, Telegram, please leave your questions in the live stream chat box, and we will ask Chris. So anyway, without further ado, I'll provide a little background and we can get started. So Chris is currently based in California, teaching at CalArts, where he works in the creative writing MFA program and in the School of Critical Studies. And his teaching areas include creative writing, sound culture, he's a musician as well, and Asian American literature. And in the past, he's also taught at USC and the University of St. Thomas in Saint Paul, Minnesota. So without further ado, welcome, Chris. Really excited to get into your work today.
Thank you, Lucian. It's great to be here. I appreciate the invitation, and I'm excited to be talking with all of you. So I'm going to read a bit first from my first book, which is called Tula. I have a second book coming out next year in April, and I'll read from that as well, and then some poems that are maybe from a third book. I don't know yet, or I have to talk to the publisher about that one. But this first book is called Tula, and the title Tula in my mother's tongue means poem, and my mother's tongue is Tagalog. But I was born in the United States. My parents were immigrants, and I didn't learn their language, partly because we were not in a community of Filipino Americans, Filipino diaspora living abroad, but also because my parents came from different parts of the Philippines, and they actually spoke different dialects, and so they kind of spoke a mishmash of each other's dialect and English. So a lot of the poems in the book are called Tula because I don't really know the language. It's more like a music to me. And so Tula means poem, but it's also kind of this strange, like to me, like a stand-in for all the things I don't know. Like when I'm in an airport, for example, I can hear, I hear someone speaking Tagalog. I hear, a couple of aunties speaking Tagalog, and I recognize the language, but I don't know what they're saying. So I'm sort of like inside and outside at the same time. Tula. An immigrant son, I have ears like the blind. Music comes easily. Night frightens me. Home late from the hospital, she comes to my door. I fake sleep. She sings a soothing song in the language I never learned. Prayers against rain. Catalog of mythic birds. As many names for music as English has for theft. Using them, I invent a country with only 2 citizens. The word I choose for mother sounds like the one for dream. The next poem is called Tula, too, because it's really one long series of poems. Each of them is called Tula, and it's scattered throughout the book. And this deals a little with family history. Two of my uncles were killed in the Philippines because they were part of an opposition movement against the government of Ferdinand Marcos, who was the father of the current president of the Philippines, Bongbong Marcos, and he declared martial law, and my uncles were part of the resistance. And during the arrest of one of my uncles, he was killed by an explosive. And then my other uncle, who was not killed, was imprisoned for many years. I think it was 7 years, much of it in solitary confinement. And eventually he escaped. But so in this poem, Tula, I'm imagining I'm the grandfather, like my grandfather, their father. Tula. One night, I am my grandfather. It's summer, no wind. My daughter's found work and love in another world. The pictures of her son look almost white. Her political brother's in prison. The youngest floats face down in a river. It's a season of abduction. God is under house arrest. Doors hang open. The day before, I saw a man so heavy with blood, his soul couldn't rise out of his body. I should send word I'm dying, but no one can move, not even to wipe the sweat from their eyes. Noon, not a sound. Even the songbirds are under martial law. I've got one more poem called Tula, and then a couple more there from the book. So I mentioned that one of the brothers, my uncles, was in prison for many years. This is sort of a dream poem about that. Tula. I live mostly in dreams. From the next cell, a man who says he's my uncle teaches me our tongue. We work on colors first, add flora, fauna, how a man in our bloodline killed a famous captain. He has a disease of the lungs. His breathing gets worse. One day, I hear them drag his body out. I'm alone. Then a voice rasps from a different cell. My other uncle, the one whose name is carved into a wall. He speaks the language of the dead, the same one his brother taught me. The window, he sings, the wind. I cross oceans, carrying moisture in my chest feathers, but I have no young, no country to speak of. My wings grow heavy. Around me, miles of water and silence. So the next poem is also from that same book and kind of treads some of the same territory, but it says after Jaswinder Bhalina. Jaswinder Bhalina is another American poet, a wonderful poet, and he had a poem called The Tallest Building in America. And so I thought, oh, this is a really cool form. So I thought, what if I switched it out and I made it for the silverest tongue in the Philippines? Because the same uncle of mine who was in prison for 7 years, he was in prison because he spoke out against the Marcos regime. Actually, he won an award for public speaking, and the award was, part of the reward was to get to speak on stage in front of the president. And as he was speaking in front of the president, he started criticizing the president. And so he's still alive, this uncle of mine. He's a very brave person, much braver than I am. And he's also a very eloquent speaker. So he was very charming and charismatic. The silverest tongue in the Philippines. I can hear my uncle muttering in the stillness of his cell, bad-mouthing Aguinaldo, reciting Marx and Mao. He has the sharpest tongue in the Philippines. It's why His Excellency the President hates him and why his doomed brother worships him. I can hear him all the way from Bloomington, wheedling inside cowrie shells, ice buildup in our gutters. I won't be born for years, but my ears are preternaturally sharp. His brother drops out of school and joins the partisans in Antique. Picks up where he left off, agrarian politics and explosives. Or maybe it's his cellmate who has the deadliest tongue in the Philippines. But my uncle is alone. It's the silence I call his cellmate because he has to give it space, be wary of its moods. It's big and oppressive, solitary. He balls up inside minutes, fissures, the spoon-dug tunnel of his throat. Even the shrikes who are supposed to angle in and give succor shy away. He meets me at the terminal in aviators and a black BMW. Even I can tell, though I hardly speak the language. He has the silverest tongue in the Philippines. Bus boys, shop girls, investors, bureaucrats, even the cop he U-turns illegally in front of. They blush, chuckle, kowtow, make promises to look out for his nephew, who has the most leaden tongue in the Philippines. We meet his friends in the lounge of the Shangri-La, oysters, live music. He doesn't drink, but talks and grows younger as he does so. He's younger even than I am, the most golden tongue in the Philippines. He wins an award for rhetoric, and the palace invites him to fly out and speak. But he gets up, lashes out at the president seated behind him, speaks storm surge, speaks outrage, speaks velocity and eruption. Now his words are getting muffled. The blizzards that give birth to me are whiting out his cell. He's spellbound, horrified. Something's finally gotten his tongue. He can hear 300 miles away, a jeep muttering up to a checkpoint, soldiers placing the faces. His brother makes a break for it, but drops what he's tucked in his shirt. The blast doesn't kill him, but is followed by a sudden report. A firearm making more silence in a dazed and speechless country. So I'm just going to have a sip of water here. So the Tula poems are sort of threaded throughout this book, but then I needed sort of a counterpoint between them. So there's a bunch of poems that are called Island. This is one of them, and they kind of form kind of an archipelago throughout the book of just imaginary islands. Island en passant, which of course is a chess move, and I know chess is a beloved game that is highly developed in Russia, and so I hope that this is taken well. Island en passant. The piano I built from memory while stranded on a desert island. First, I had to realize I needed it. The rest was mostly guesswork. In the end, I had something new of bark, bamboo, and grass. A ramshackle, a shamble, reeds in rows like maps of muscle. It was too heavy to move, so there it stayed, going gray in sun and wind, silent after I was rescued, except for the living things it later housed, afraid of their own infinitesimal steps. Music the stars would make if they were as small as they looked. Okay, good. We're okay for time. So the next poem, it's actually one of my older poems, but it hasn't been in a book yet. So I think in my next book, I might be speaking to a lot of different art pieces. I love ekphrastic poems, poems that are based on or speaking to paintings, sculptures, works of art. And this is a poem that speaks to painting, please forgive my pronunciation, but of Kazimir Malevich from 1918, which in English is called White on White. I love so many Russian artists, especially musicians. I played percussion. I'm a percussionist. I played in college and beyond. And I think some of my favorite composers are Shostakovich and Prokofiev. And so this painting by Malevich sort of ignited something in my mind. And if you haven't seen it, it's a white square with sort of a slightly lighter white square that goes off it, but at it slightly in an angle. White on white. The difference between chess and chess, if white could move against white, white as absence, white as prism, your snowy field laid across mine. A blind faith in January hardly noticed. Meanwhile, the eye wanders off to a blank page. Not to solve chess problems, but to solve chess. Doing what one does in a dark room, but the opposite. Okay. I'm writing a novel right now that involves chess, and so I'm just thinking about that poem in the back of my head. I'm like, This next poem will be, in the next few poems are going to be in my forthcoming book. And this one's called States and Capitals, which is sort of like a subject you'd study in grade school. But it speaks sort of, speaks back to an event that happened a few years ago in 2021 on January 6th, when a riot of people attacked the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. States and capitals. The capital of January is January. The capital of a hospital is the morgue. The capital of the hospital is a refrigerated truck. The capital of the truck is oil. Oil tells the president to stand down. The president looks towards the Capitol building. It is a capital idea. The sentries that guard the idea do not believe in it. They believe in the guarding, that only they know who it must be guarded from. The capital is in each of them. It is infected with the anti-idea, the belief in the president. The viral load increases, the capital thick with infection. The virus builds its capital in each branch of the lung. When the lungs no longer work, it moves its capital to the trash-covered ground. The capital of death is under siege. Death builds its capital in America. The nursery is the capital of death. Death is a country lacking hospital beds. Inside the cab of its refrigerated truck, death idles the engine. This is the part where in a reading, I apologize that so many of these poems are dark, but there will be a little bit of light, I think, at the end of this batch of poems. I lost my mother about 9 years ago, and it took several years for me to be able to sort of process and talk about it. But that was good advice I got from family and friends who said that, right now, immediately after you lose a loved one, you just feel these waves of pain. But they said, and it was true, that after a few years, you'd be able to think of them and think of mostly only the happy memories that you have, if it was someone that you loved and you have happy memories of it, of course. So this poem's called The Third Anniversary of Your Mother's Death. Take a selfie beside the Library of Alexandria. Take another as the burning library itself, grown with the labor. Already you are giving birth to the idea of the ancient world. No technology has surpassed the mirror. Freud says the goal of grieving is introjection. I am triggered by the word encrypt. I stare at the midpoint between my eyes until the smoke begins to crown. One story contained galleons, another the scent of lilies. I should add to that the poem started because a friend of mine, the poet Robin Cost Lewis, was talking about when people die in her community. She's an African-American poet, poet laureate of Los Angeles. And she says when someone dies in her community, people say, there goes the library. And I was, when my mom died, for many reasons, I was sad, but part of it was because she had so many stories and those were lost, the ones that I didn't remember or write down. Okay, Golden Age. This is also in the new book that's coming out. Do I want to say anything about this one? So Lucian mentioned that I used to teach at the University of St. Thomas. And so for 8 years before I came back here to California, I moved into my father's house, the house I grew up in. And I moved in with my wife and my 2 children because we were thinking that we would live there temporarily while he was grieving because my mother had died, and while we looked for a house ourselves. But it turned out that we never ended up buying a house. So we lived there. My father needed us. He was, older, and he was traditional and used to, I think in a lot of ways, my mom doing a lot of the things for him that needed to be done around the house. And then we needed a place to live. And we also were very sad because my wife's family, we left behind in California. Of course, we're close to them again. But so we all sort of lived, 5 of us, in a house that maybe should have 4 people max. So it was kind of tight. But it was also, in many ways, those years, what we all needed too. Golden Age. It used to embarrass me when my father talked back to the TV. Since my mother died, he doesn't talk anymore, but falls asleep and wombed by voices, anchors, procedurals, the invisible labor of Foley artists. My teacher gasped when the Challenger exploded on live TV. We had to wait for the set to warm up from a white-hot pinprick of light. It was so heavy the librarian warned it could crush us. We watched as the column of smoke split in 2. Gasp comes from Old Norse, gespa, and shares a base with brag, bluster, and babble. My second week of teaching kindergarten, a girl came in and said she saw a plane on TV fly into a tower. By the end of the day, a colleague had rushed in and announced that we'd started to bomb Afghanistan. We are still bombing Afghanistan. My father turns the volume up to 77, 78. Each morning, I have to crank the volume back down. His hearing loss could be described as severe to profound. Still, he must feel bathed in those shifting backdrops, those faces, profound from the Latin for before the bottom. In order to remember what to capitalize in McAuliffe, I think of how it contains the chemical symbol for gold. The noise of the television soothes everyone on the other side of the house. It tells us someone is watching but not watching us, not the room where we can finally make love undetected. I was taught to be silent when praying. She was taught to pray out loud, the way our sons threw up their hands when we could solve any unhappiness by lifting them up. Up, they would say. Up. The crew of the Challenger were likely conscious the whole way down. I want to lay like this a little longer before getting up, before erasing all traces of intimacy. Sometimes I go back out and pour my father a finger of Jura, and he pretends he hasn't been sleeping. I've been doing this since I was a boy, sneaking out after bedtime and over my father's shoulder, watching the Cold War unfold. The atomic number for gold is 79. God, he says, when there's a protest, a wildfire, a shooting. God, as though there were someone else in the room. The next, actually the last poems here are from this forthcoming book called Small Wars Manual. I'll talk about that title a little more in a moment, but these next two poems are from another series that speaks to visual art. There's a Vietnamese American photographer named An My Le, and she has this wonderful series called Small Wars. And in the poems that I'm reading from, she was taking pictures with American military personnel who were preparing to go to Iraq and fight a war in Iraq following 9/11, which I mentioned in the previous poem, the so-called War on Terror in the early 2000s. And so the photographs that she took were of Americans in the United States in the desert training to go fight in the desert in the Middle East. And so they're kind of untitled, but you see people that are preparing for war, including in the first poem I'm about to read here, someone wearing a bomb tech suit, training to defuse explosives. And in the second poem, Night Operations, this poem, she took a time-lapse photo of practicing night strikes at night. So you just see streaks of light, and you can't even tell. You can tell there's a desert ground, and you can tell there's a night sky, but you just see streaks of light as rockets are fired at the ground. So this first poem is called Explosive Ordnance Disposal, 2003 to 2004. That's the name of the photograph that it speaks to. And in here I mention two things that might help. One is there was a shooter, as there oftentimes are, in Dallas, and he was targeting police officers. And so this is the first time when the police responded to him that we used a robot, a remote-controlled robot, to deliver explosives to kill another human being as through police action. I think it had been done before in military action, but the police used this robot with a gripper to carry explosives to this area where the shooter was. That way no officers' lives were endangered, but they killed the shooter that way. And the other thing is that in the Renaissance, to study human anatomy, bodies were brought in to these surgical theaters in Bologna and elsewhere, and they would cut up the bodies to study how the human body worked. And if you ever go to the surgical theater in Bologna, there's this amazing place where people would watch someone do this, and they have a little trap door in the floor, so that way the parts of the body that are left over after this anatomy, they step on this lever, the hole opens up, and then those parts just sort of drop down somewhere, probably to be incinerated. Really horrible stuff for a Monday morning. Sorry, everyone. Explosive ordnance disposal. Does it sound like a practice room inside the bomb suit? Is the robot the kind the Dallas police rigged with a pound of C4 to kill the cop killer? When its gripper opens, does it sound like the trap door in the anatomical theater vanishing the cut and unused Renaissance parts? Night Operations 3. This is for the photograph of the time lapse at night of rockets being fired. If lightning is made entirely of error, what is an airstrike? Impossible to tell who is striking who, the desert or the night sky. But possible now to imagine death arriving as light, and light the cessation of time. So now a couple of poems from that book. The book is called Small Wars Manual, and there is a book called the U.S. Marine Corps Small Wars Manual. It was published in the 1930s, and it's full of wisdom and knowledge that came from all of these small wars that were fought in the early 20th century, sometimes called banana wars, because banana companies based in the U.S. had important holdings in countries like Honduras and Nicaragua. So they basically sent the U.S. Marines to go and put down when locals were trying to protest to have more control over this land. But the reason I got interested in it is because one of the first wars that basically informed this manual of how to conduct these wars was the Philippine-American War. My parents are from the Philippines, and in 1898, the Philippine people staged a successful revolution against their Spanish colonizers. But just as they were winning this war, the U.S. was defeating Spain in the Spanish-American War, and they bought the Philippines from the United States. So Americans that were en route to the Philippines, they're originally going to help the Filipinos fight the Spanish, instead put down the Filipino rebellion. So there was a war that lasted until 1902 with tens of thousands of civilian Filipino casualties. And then as a result, the Philippines became a colony of the U.S. So what I wanted to do with that manual, this manual called the U.S. Marine Corps Manual that is informed by all this knowledge of invading other countries, was erase it. So erasure poems are poems that take a document like this one, and you erase words that you don't want to use, and you keep the words that you do use. So all the poems that you see in front of you, each one, this one says 6.6 infantry patrols. This is one section of the Small Wars Manual, and I erased a bunch of words and kept these words inside. Sometimes I broke words apart and just kept a letter here and a letter there in order to find a word that I wanted to find. So 6.6, infantry patrols, reconnaissance, and security. To uncover an enemy in the field, set the field on fire. Follow the sound, the rapture. Follow false maps, cities overrun by feral dogs. Keep the exit close, but keep your rifle closer. 3.3, logistics, transportation. Distance to a camel is but one form of memory, like the weight of aviaries, dead lakes, cities without roads. Distance to the mule is work. For the horse, it's a kind of detachment. Bulls use distance to careen and lash. For a gun, it is an instant. For the spider, crude conversion. To a tree, it's a system of thought approaching language. 1.5, introduction, the chain of command. On the shores of an unfamiliar country, trust the impulse for analogy. Each to each, and else to elsewhere. To call the world an ocean is an error. The world is an island, and you are half shipwreck, half siren. And the last one of these poems, before I read, is one happier poem. 4.5, training programs and schedules. The too long didn't read version. Peacetime is the training period. War is the performance. My children have never seen war. It is also true that they have never lived without it. So I wanted to end with one more poem from my first book called Tula. And this is a poem that came from when my first child was born. And my wife and I went to all of these classes to prepare, not just for giving birth, which is hard enough, but then for the real hard part, which is what comes afterwards, and you take the baby home. And so you have to learn all these new words, literally. But then all these things come and go so quickly. My son's now 15. He's going to be 16 in a week. And so one of the things that disappeared quickly is that when babies are newborn, they smell so good. I don't know if it's the chemical bonds that make your brain think that, so that way you take care of them. But there's a smell that goes, it's almost like a night bloom. And it's gone after a very short while, after a few weeks or something like that. That's what it seemed like to me. Thank you so much for this. I'm going to read this last poem. It's called Some Words. It means a new vocabulary. Oxytocin, for the bond that makes mothers shed milk at a wail. Melia, for the grainy pimples on the bridge of his fingernail nose. And before I've read Lanugo, the down between his shoulder blades gone. The scent, too. Night bloom freshness, nape and limb. No name I've found, though, if it were an ideogram, I'd write it rind and aura, field and fold, cycle that must be tended, or to stoke a little fire. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. That was great.
Thank you.
To it. Your poems. Just to introduce myself to everyone, my name is Blair Dunbar. I'm going to be moderating the Meet the Poet sessions going forward. I live in Chicago and I work in cybersecurity communications. But I did live for a long time in Russia, about 6.5 years, which is where I connected with the AMC. And I did volunteered while living in Moscow, and I worked with Education USA Russia as well when I was out there. So I don't think we have any questions right now from the audience, but I have plenty of questions. So I wanted to ask, you mentioned a couple different, things where you get your inspiration. You talked about, some of your favorite composers or painters, your background. Just wanted to see where you kind of, for other writers, advice for where they can find their inspiration, and how do you know, I know now you said you're writing a book about chess. So how do you know, kind of what lines to follow?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, I'm thinking of when you asked that question, the first thing that popped in my head was I heard this poet Robert Pinsky speak once before. He is the former U.S. poet laureate, and he grew up in Boston. And he said that when he was a kid, he would ride the T, which is the public transportation in Boston. Lots of people complain about it, right? About the T. But it's great. I mean, here in LA, we're trying to develop public transportation, but you just have to have a car here. But Pinsky said that when he was a kid, he'd be riding the train and he'd hear people's conversations around him. And then there's a rhythm of the train, like dun 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 dun, and then a rhythm would get in his ear, and he'd sort of repeat a phrase in his head, and that's sort of how a lot of poems began for him. He'd be like, someone would say, "The other day, a baseball game," and then just that phrase, the rhythm would get in his ear. And so, if I start to obsess over a phrase, then oftentimes it's the beginning of a poem, or if I hear something, sometimes I'll see it in a newspaper, or one of my kids will say it, a combination of words, and then there's just a rhythm to it, a music to it that's interesting. And so I think maybe your unconscious is trying to tell you something when you hear that rhythm. It's like when you wake up with a song in your head, like maybe there's a reason why there's that song, or maybe not. Maybe it's just like completely random, but that's where it starts often for me. And then, like you said, like a subject, like with chess or whatever, like one of my teachers used to say, like, she'd say, "Send in the coal cars." And she meant, if there's stuff to mine, like if there's a lot of coal down there, then you just send in the coal cars and mine it for what you can get. So if you're interested in a subject, like you don't know why, but like maybe you're obsessed with Shohei Ohtani, the baseball player. So maybe, just think about why is it that and then write about it until you're sick of it. And if you don't ever get sick of it, good for you. That means you got something to write about the rest of your life.
Yeah, and so that's interesting because I don't know, I've taken writing classes before, and there's kind of sometimes this running advice that you should write what you know, right? Write in your own experiences. But you would say that it's okay to draw, inspiration for things that maybe that's your experience. And then if you're drawn to a subject like, you mentioned baseball or coal mining, what would be the best way then to, feel confident writing about it? Is it just research or?
Yeah, that's great, because there is that dictum, right? Write what you know. But I'm so sorry I get this wrong. I know it was a Russian writer. I think it's either Osip Mandelstam or Isaac Babel who said it's the flip side. So one thing is write what you know, and then the other side is you must know everything, which you can't know everything, right? But I think he said you must know everything. That's how it's translated in English. So I'm always doing research, right? And the research is a lot of the fun of the writing. Like with Small Wars Manual, that's how I found it in the first place, because I was researching the Philippine-American War, because it's another fiction project I was working on. I'm still working on. And then I found out about the Small Wars Manual, and I was like, what is that? That's interesting. And so then I did all this research on it, and then it ended up being years of looking into it and like, oh, how are these wars related? Is there kind of a genetic relationship between the Philippine-American War and the Vietnam War, right? Or the war in Vietnam? That's an interesting thing. We call it, we name a country a war, like Vietnam, that means a war. And then the writer Viet Nguyen, points out it's not a war, it's a country, right? So, and
yeah.
So it's just interesting to see those relationships between things. So the research itself becomes kind of its own reward in a way, and then you'll get other writing ideas out of it. Like you'll research one thing, you're like, oh, you know what, this is interesting, and then later on you want to write about one of these other side quests that you came across.
Yeah, that's great, and I love that. Yeah, because I've always been told write what you know. So it's interesting to hear you and you talk about all these different subjects. We do have a question from one of our watchers. Can you go further into the experience of having your family members speak a language that you don't speak? This is also an issue in Russia, particularly with the Tatar language dying out among younger generations because their parents didn't teach them.
Yeah. Oh, that's really fascinating. I don't. What's the name of that language again? I'm just curious.
Tatars. So Tatars came in with the Mongol Empire, and they're mainly situated. There's an independent republic, Kazan, which is the Tataran capital.
Okay, yeah, I find the subject so fascinating and heartbreaking. Right. So for me, I didn't not learn my language because of force, but that's the case in other places, like within the United States too. So there are the Native American peoples of the United States, American Indian peoples, Comanche, for example. Children were taken from their parents and put into boarding schools intentionally, so they would break the kind of connection between one generation and the next, and then the younger generation wouldn't learn the language. So that was intentional, trying to make it so that way people would assimilate and lose their ties to the past, right? So that was like something that was done intentionally. For me, it wasn't an intentional thing done, although it was sort of like maybe pressures of assimilating too. My parents wanted me to be American. They thought, like, for me to be successful in the United States, I needed to, this is the language I speak, right? And then I ended up getting a PhD in English. That's funny. It was like, okay, all right, well, I really like English a lot. But then it's a complicated history too. So so what's happening to the Tatar language, that's happening all over the world. And there are people who are doing amazing things that are trying to, preserve, audio and video records of native speakers of languages around the world, so they don't die out, right? And there are other languages that people are trying to bring back and revive. This happened, Israel is a fascinating case, right? That like in the 1940s, a language that was used in diaspora was brought back to try to speak as a national language for this country. And so we see this lots of different situations in different countries. And like I said, with the United States and other countries, sometimes there's an intentional desire to kind of erase that that part of the heritage, because the language is so important. Like it's the key for history, personal family history, cultural history, sometimes lore, like what herbs should be used for what ailments, like people are discovering in countries like in Brazil and elsewhere that indigenous tribes have this knowledge of like what plants can be used for certain purposes, what animals can be used. So there's a lot that's just destroyed when language is lost. As a kind of like reaction to that, partly my wife and I have, from a young age, we had our kids go to Japanese school. Like my wife is Japanese American, and Japanese is not like an endangered language by any means. But like we both wanted our children to speak at least one of their heritage languages and to really know it. And it was a struggle often at times. It was like there were so many mornings where it's like, I don't want to go to Japanese school because it was Saturday mornings. And I was like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? Is this terrible? But then like somewhere along the line, our older son, like that became like part of his identity. And he's like, no, I want to. I was saying, you can quit if you want. It was hard work for us too, to have to bring them and to make sure they did their homework. But then after a while, he's like, no, I want to do this. And he wants to go study in Japan now too. And so it became part of who he was. And, there's actually, even though Japanese is not endangered, there is a part of our history here in California, specifically in the United States, that during World War II, Japanese Americans were put into camps because they were suspected of being possible spies, even though the people were born in the United States. And then when they were finally released from camp, they were instructed, don't gather in groups and don't speak Japanese. Just people will hate you because we fought a war against Japan. So don't speak the language. And so a lot of Japanese Americans of a certain generation in California don't speak the language because they were ashamed and they were literally told not to speak the language. And so for us to want them to speak Japanese in 2024, there's an echo of history to it, right? It's not just like, it's worth it just to have that just for the family, so he could speak to his cousins and his grandparents, and that's worth it in itself. But there's also a value in it as a community that, to push back against erasure and silence.
Yeah, on that same note, because a lot of your poetry does draw from your background and your culture, do you have any advice or maybe just almost words of encouragement to poets to encourage them to embrace, their background when they're writing, especially if it's a little, obviously yours is a little different. We have a lot of Russian students, some of them be Taran or Baku. So sort of encouragement almost for leaning into that when writing.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think that the more words and the more music a language has, the healthier and the more rich and poetic it can be. So that if, English is a mutt language, I often say, right? Like it was, so like, just look, even like 1,000 years ago, 1066, France invaded England and all these French words came into English, and it happened, there's Anglo-Saxon and Germanic and all these things that come into English. And not coincidentally, like 500 years later, when Shakespeare's writing, like he's able to do all these things with language because there's so many more things you can do with language, with these other words and other sounds that come into it. And in American English now, it's really interesting how the language is changing, because around the globe, there's people speaking it and using it for different purposes. Like people speak English in Singapore and the Philippines and in India. And other words come into the language, like just loan words like sushi or karaoke, for example. So with Russian, like if there are poets who are bringing in their heritage from other parts of the world into Russian, it'll make Russian even more beautiful than it already is. There'll be other words and other ways of phrasing things that come into it. in English right now, some of my favorite poets, like Eduardo Corral, for example, who bring in their Spanish language. Sometimes they code switch and they use actual Spanish words within the English language, and it brings in a different music. Lin-Manuel Miranda, for example, like the songwriter, right? Like the kind of rhymes that he can use because he can code switch and drop a rhyme. Abuela, get the umbrella. Why did you tell her? You know, like that Bruno song, like that. There's a different kind of music that can get into language thanks to that knowledge of his.
Yeah, I didn't think about that, but it's something I actually really enjoy. I didn't know the term code switching, but when they bring in, different words from different languages, talk. What would be your advice for people interested in poetry, particularly people who don't have any formal English education background or creative writing background?
Yeah, it's funny. People didn't used to have. There was no I don't think John Keats got an MFA in writing poetry, right, in the 1800s. The most important thing to do is to read a lot and then write a lot. It sounds so glib, but that really is the thing. It's just to read. And what's great about getting an education is there's somebody who's done it before you, who'll tell you, read this. And then if you say, oh, I really like this, they can say, well, read this. And you can go to the internet for that, right? You can go to the library for that, but it's not the same as knowing something. So becoming part of a community is important too. Like if you find other people who are interested in poetry and you can just have coffee with them and talk about things, and they can say, oh, I read this writer, Ocean Vuong, really great. And then, so then you check that out and then you can share that with them too. The more you read, the more possible grammars and phrasings and word choices will be in your ear. And then the more you write, the more confident you'll become too. And I write terribly on all my first drafts. They're always really bad. And I think the biggest challenge for writers is they're so hard on themselves at the beginning. So I would write a lot, and then don't be too hard on yourself as well. I always tell my students, when you write a first draft, put it away for a while, right? Put it away for a few weeks because you're too close to it when you first write it. So it's kind of like precious and you don't want to change this, you don't want to change that, or you're too hard and oh, this is terrible. But if you put it away for a few weeks, then you can get a distance from it. You can feel a little more impartial, like an editor. And then you could see with a more impartial eye what's good and what's bad. And then as you develop that eye and ear, you can make those choices probably more confidently. And then that eye and the ear is also developed by reading a lot. Like you find a poet oh, I love this poet. And you have to figure out what it is you like about them. You read this poet and say, oh, I like this. Why do I like it? And you have to spend some time thinking about why you like that poet.
And so on that note, reading, and I know you've mentioned some names, what would be let's put it this way, 3 contemporary poets you recommend, and then 3 more traditional for our lovers of traditional rhymes and structure?
Yeah, contemporary poets. So there's one, this poet's not alive any longer, unfortunately. He died in 1996. But so many poets that I know now refer back to him. Larry Levis is his name. It sounds like a very, I don't know, like a Las Vegas kind of, not Larry Levis, but he was a really wonderful poet. And the imagery in his poems, he writes these really long poems sometimes, or long lines, not like Whitman long lines, but lines that are just packed with really surreal images and kind of this almost offhand, casual sounding voice somehow, but that makes amazing pictures in your head. So he's a very important poet for me. Diane Seuss is a poet who I'm friends with, who has written some of the most amazing books of the last few years. She wrote this book called Frank, which is a collection of sonnets. But they're not traditional sonnets. So I'll get to the traditional poets in a second, but sonnets, there are 14 lines like a sonnet, but they don't rhyme. But there's something going on with the way she paces the poem that's a lot like a traditional sonnet. She's wonderful. And then I'm going to segue with the third choice because it kind of goes in traditional too, because I'm teaching this class right now that's called Poetry, Form, and Resistance. And so I'm interested in how the form of a poem can also be part of its message in a way, or part of how it resists, like a lot of different things, resisting war, resisting. Some poets are pushing back against gentrification, and some poets are pushing against the erasure of their ancestry and language, things like that, right? And so two African-American poets I can think of who use traditional formal structures like the sonnet, but they use it in a way to talk about police violence or to talk about, racism in America. And but they do it, and it's a formal poem that uses a rhyme scheme and uses a sonnet structure, but they do it in a way where it still sounds like a contemporary person speaking. So Jericho Brown is one. He has a book called The Tradition. And so he's very conscious about being part of a tradition. And he writes some sonnets in there, but he also creates a new form that sort of breaks the sonnet called duplex, where it's like these, like, it's 14 lines like a sonnet, but then it does a couplet and a couplet. And the last line of each couplet is the first line of the next. So there's all this repeating, kind of hooking together. And then Terrence Hayes is another African-American poet who has really wonderful formal. Not only does he use traditional forms like the sonnet, but he also creates new forms all the time. And I used his form for my new book. I use this form of poems that he calls the Pecha Kucha. He borrows it from this Japanese presentation style. And then other traditional poets. I really love Robert Frost, actually. It's super, sounds kind of uncool to say that, but like the richness and musicality of his language and the way he could tell stories. It's beautiful poems. I love those poems. Gwendolyn Brooks, too, an African-American poet who wrote some formal poems. If you're into rhyme schemes and traditional prosody and rhythm and stuff, Gwendolyn Brooks is a great poet. Yeah. Do you want me to go further back than that, like than the 20th century?
No, I think these are good. We got 6, which is good.
Okay, awesome. Good. I wasn't sure. I was like, did I lose track? I didn't remember if it was 5 or 6.
Well, I think we're at the hour. Lucian, I don't know if there's anything else we need. But Chris, thank you so much. It was really enjoyable to listen to your poetry and talk with you. And I know you said you had a new book coming out soon.
Yeah, and in April. So
In April.
please look for it. Yeah, thank you. It's called Small Wars Manual, and it'll be from Milkweed Editions, but you could probably get it on Amazon and elsewhere. You can pre-order it now too.
Great. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This was great.
Well, thank you. It's great to meet you, Blair, and thank you everyone else. Bye.